The following program contains graphic descriptions of violence and may include disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. Tonight on Evil Exposed Killers, we explore the terrifying story of Fred and Rosemary West, infamously known as the House of Horrors killers. Behind the walls of their seemingly ordinary home, they carried out a series of brutal murders, turning 25 Cromwell Street into a place of unimaginable terror. Join us as we reveal how this couple turned a quiet street into a graveyard, and the true horror that lay hidden behind closed doors. Fred West was born on September 29, 1941, in Muchmarkel, Herefordshire, England. His childhood was marked by dysfunction, abuse, and a twisted family environment. Raised by a violent father and an overbearing mother who allegedly engaged in incestuous relationships with her children, Fred grew up with a skewed understanding of love and relationships. By his teenage years, he was already known for petty crime and troubling behavior, further exacerbated by a severe head injury from a motorcycle accident at 17. This injury, some speculate, may have intensified his already violent tendencies. In 1969, Fred met Rosemary Letts, who was only 15 years old. Rosemary had also endured a traumatic childhood, with a violent father and a mother struggling with severe mental health issues. Rosemary quickly fell under Fred's influence, and the two began a relationship that would lead them down a path of unimaginable brutality. By 1972, they were married and moved into a modest home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, which would become infamous as the House of Horrors. Together, Fred and Rosemary West would turn their home into a living nightmare for many unsuspecting victims. Their first known murder as a couple occurred in 1971. Fred's first wife, Rena Costello, and her friend Anna McFall, who had been Fred's lover, both vanished under suspicious circumstances. Rena's dismembered body was later discovered in a remote field, her remains bearing the marks of severe mutilation. It was clear that Fred had killed her, but his penchant for sadism had grown, and now, with Rosemary by his side, his brutality would only escalate. Fred and Rosemary began luring young women and girls to their home under various pretenses. Some were offered jobs as nannies or lodgers, while others were promised work or assistance. Many of their victims were vulnerable, estranged from their families, or living unstable lives, making them easy prey for the West's sinister plans. Once inside, these women would be trapped in a nightmare. The Wests would drug and imprison their victims in their cellar, turning it into a torture chamber. The walls of the cellar would bear witness to unspeakable acts. Bound and gagged, the victims were subjected to horrific sexual abuse and sadistic torture. The couple worked in tandem, with Fred inflicting physical pain while Rosemary took a disturbing pleasure in humiliating and degrading their captives. Rosemary was often the one to initiate the torture, showing a level of cruelty that matched, if not exceeded, Fred's. One of their most horrific murders was that of 17-year-old Mary Bastholm, who went missing in 1968 while waiting for a bus. Though her body was never found, it is believed she fell into the hands of Fred and Rosemary West. Other confirmed victims included Linda Goff, a 19-year-old seamstress who disappeared in 1973. Her remains, like others, were found buried under the cellar floor of their home. Linda's body had been subjected to grotesque mutilation. Fred and Rosemary had removed fingers and toes, keeping them as macabre trophies. Between 1973 and 1979, the West's lust for murder continued unabated. Their victims included 15-year-old schoolgirl Carol Ann Cooper, 21-year-old Lucy Partington, and 18-year-old Juanita Mott, all of whom vanished without a trace before their remains were eventually discovered. Each girl had been tortured in the cellar, subjected to unimaginable suffering before being killed and dismembered. One of their most depraved crimes was the murder of 16-year-old Shirley Hubbard in 1974. When Shirley's remains were uncovered, her head was wrapped entirely in duct tape with a rubber tube inserted into her nose to keep her alive, prolonging her agony as she suffocated slowly. The level of sadism involved in these killings showed the depth of their perverse desires. It wasn't just strangers who fell victim to the Wests. In 1987, their own daughter, Heather West, became a target. Heather had grown up in a house filled with abuse, witnessing the horrors committed by her parents. She reportedly threatened to go to the authorities, and in response, Fred and Rosemary murdered her. Heather's body was dismembered and buried in the garden, and her death became a grim warning to the other children in the family. Whenever they misbehaved, Fred would chillingly remind them that they could end up under the patio like Heather. The West's crimes continued with an almost ritualistic nature. Each murder seemed to feed their hunger for control and domination. They thrived on the suffering of others, and their partnership allowed them to act out their darkest fantasies. Rosemary, in particular, was known for her manipulative charm. She often initiated contact with potential victims, drawing them in with her seemingly friendly demeanor before revealing her true, monstrous nature. The bodies piled up, buried in the garden, under the cellar floor, and in other properties connected to the couple. But for over 2 decades, Fred and Rosemary managed to evade detection. The walls of 25 Cromwell Street held onto their secrets tightly, even as the neighbors grew suspicious and rumors began to swirl about the couple's strange behavior and the young women who seemed to disappear around them. It was not until the early 1990s, when the West's remaining children began to show signs of severe trauma and abuse, that the authorities began to take a closer look at what was happening behind the closed doors of 25 Cromwell Street. Reports from social workers and neighbors who had grown increasingly concerned about the safety of the children finally prompted the police to investigate. The investigation initially focused on the disappearance of Heather West, but it quickly became clear that there was much more to uncover. The police were granted a search warrant, and what they found would shock the nation. On February 24, 1994, police began excavating the property at 25 Cromwell Street. Almost immediately, they discovered the remains of 2 young women buried in the garden. Over the next few days, the remains of more victims were unearthed, both in the garden and the cellar of the home. Each body bore evidence of brutal torture and mutilation. The discovery of 9 bodies at the property, including Heather West, confirmed the darkest suspicions about Fred and Rosemary. The evidence was overwhelming. Each victim had been subjected to unspeakable horrors, often involving prolonged periods of torture and sexual abuse. Many of the remains were missing bones, and several showed signs of having been bound or restrained. The basement, where many of the murders had taken place, was filled with disturbing artifacts, restraints, masks, and tools used in their gruesome acts. Fred West was immediately arrested, and shortly thereafter, Rosemary was also taken into custody. Fred seemed almost proud of his crimes, boasting about his deeds with a chilling lack of remorse. He confessed to many of the murders, but maintained that Rosemary had been equally complicit, a claim she vehemently denied. During the investigation, more remains were discovered at other properties linked to the Wests. As the police pieced together the timeline, it became clear that Fred and Rosemary had been killing for years. They were charged with multiple counts of murder, but the true number of their victims may never be known. Fred's confessions were erratic and often contradictory. At times, he seemed to revel in the details of his crimes, only to become evasive and vague. He was clearly enjoying the attention his confessions brought him, but his erratic behavior made it difficult to determine the full extent of his guilt. On January 1st, 1995, before he could stand trial, Fred West hanged himself in his prison cell, taking with him the secrets of his monstrous deeds. Rosemary West, however, was brought to trial later that year. The prosecution presented a damning case, with testimony from survivors and witnesses painting a horrific picture of her active participation in the crimes. She was found guilty of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Even now, decades later, the full truth of what happened at 25 Cromwell Street remains shrouded in darkness. The case of Fred and Rosemary West is a chilling reminder of the evil that can exist behind closed doors and the unimaginable horrors that some are capable of inflicting on the innocent. The story of Fred and Rosemary West, the House of Horrors killers, is a chilling reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight. Their brutal crimes left a trail of suffering that still haunts many today. As we honor the innocent lives lost, let us remain vigilant against the darkness that often lurks where we least expect it. Thank you for watching. If you found this episode compelling, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that uncover the darkest sides of human nature. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you next time. Please like and subscribe to Evil Exposed, For more riveting stories,